Author's note from Al Capone Does My Shirts, Alcatraz Island. When truth is stranger than fiction, Al Capone Does My Shirts is a work of fiction, but many of the details about life on Alcatraz are true. During the 29 years when Alcatraz was a working penitentiary from 1934 to 1963 or so, as one of convicts described, it's a maximum security long-term burying ground for convicts of particularly vile renown. The families of most of the guards and prison administrators lived on the island. Between 50 and 60 families resided on Alcatraz at any given time. 9 babies were born to mothers who lived on the island, and some children lived their entire childhood on Alcatraz. There was a whole village on the island, a post office with a pelican insignia postmark, a tiny grocery store, a play area called the Parade Grounds, and an officers' club, complete with a bowling alley. Many of the kids lived in 64 building, an Army-issued apartment building that still stands today. No children were ever hurt or taken hostage during the Alcatraz penitentiary years. One guard felt that there was an unwritten code of rule among the inmates that family men were safe. This may have been true for some convicts, but certainly not all. During the Battle of Alcatraz in May 1946, 2 guards were killed and 14 injured. Almost all were family men. At least one autobiography of an Alcatraz inmate contains detailed escape plans, which include taking the warden's wife as a hostage. Today, it seems surprising that so many children lived on Alcatraz, but at the time, Alcatraz was thought to be a better place for kids than the city. Our parents frequently said they felt safer living on Alcatraz than in San Francisco. There was no traffic, no burglaries, few of us, in fact, worried about security. It was a low-crime neighborhood, after all. Fences and locked gates were everywhere, yet some residents didn't lock their doors. All of our bad guys are locked up is a refrain sounded again and again in the handwritten accounts of island life found in the Alcatraz Island Ranger Library. Also, it was much cheaper to live on Alcatraz. 1935 was a depression year, and San Francisco rents, even then, were costly. Prison guards were not highly paid. As one former Alcatraz guard stated, he never even considered living off the island as it was too expensive to live in San Francisco. But perhaps the most important reason families lived on the island in the early years was because Warden James A. Johnston wanted it this way. Ready access to his staff of guards in the event of a prison break was an important aspect of his overall security plan. High-ranking officers were expected, perhaps even required, to live on Alcatraz. When we had a disturbance, if we were at a party, we didn't put on our coats or anything. We just went right up the hill. They used to call down at 64 building, and the phone was right outside my apartment. And we answered the phone, and they'd say, "We have trouble in the cell house." And that's all they had to say. Everybody available went. The warden lived in a beautiful mansion located right next to the door to the cell house. Warden Johnston, dubbed Old Saltwater by the cons, opened Alcatraz and ran it for 14 years. Warden Johnston's youngest daughter, Barbara, also lived on the island, although she bears no resemblance whatsoever to Piper. She must not be adorable. During 1935, all of the Alcatraz kids took the boat to San Francisco, where they attended school. The only exception was made for kindergarten-aged children who attended kindergarten held on Alcatraz, taught by one of the moms who lived on the island. As you might imagine, saying you lived on Alcatraz did, in fact, garner quite a lot of attention at school. Some kids thought it was weird. Others were dazzled by the prison stories. Most kids who lived on Alcatraz seemed to take their prison for granted. Jolene Babyak was one kid on the island during the 50s, said it was like living next to the police station. She said she wasn't scared because there were so many guards around. Al Capone, AZ-85, was an inmate on Alcatraz for 4.5 years, from 1934 to 1939. Warden Johnston described the intense interest of Capone this way. The newspaper reporters telephoned me almost every day. How is Capone? Is he still there? Is he going to be transferred? Where is he working? Very little information came out of Alcatraz, and erroneous reporting was rampant. So lies. At times, Warren Johnson said, I became fed up with the gossip about him that had no foundation. In fact, a story was featured that though Al Capone was in Alcatraz, he was sending orders to a London haberdasher for silk underwear. I assured the director of the Bureau of Prisons that there was no truth in such a report, that I had seen Capone wearing the regulation underwear and had noticed it particularly because it had the waist of his drawers fastened with a safety pin. The residents of the island were as interested in Capone as the rest of the world. The boy described watching Capone's first footsteps on Alcatraz. Our apartment overlooked the island's docks, and my mother's old Kodak box camera took a photo of the first convict's arrival. We lived along the building's upper gallery, but we went down to a level to be closer to the action that we had waited months to see. Our binoculars located Al Capone. His face was familiar in those days. No others stood out. Another woman said the first prisoners arrived, among them Al Capone. She laughed. Women and children were requested to stay indoors until the prisoners were locked in their cells. Well, we kind of snuck a look before the boat docked. Capone's first job on Alcatraz was working the mangle in the laundry facility. Thought to be an undesirable post, often offered as a first job because it was boring, back-breaking work. The faculty handled the laundry before everyone who lived on the island and for some of the local bases, like the ones on the Angel Island. The laundry scheme is fiction. No record of kids selling the opportunity to have a shirt laundered by Capone has ever been found. However, there is documentation of at least one Army officer, a private stationed on Angel Island, writing home to that his laundryman was Al Capone. In fact, after completing Al Capone Does My Shirts, I discovered the World War II GIs sometimes used the phrase Al Capone Does My Shorts to indicate that they were stationed in San Francisco. Capone was no longer on Alcatraz then, but the Capone mythology was powerful as ever. In 1935, the convicts played handball and softball in the walled-off recreation yard on the island, and Capone was thought to have played first base. Capone liked baseball. As a kid, he pitched sandlot baseball well enough to cherish dreams of turning pro. The convicts were quite serious about their games and kept careful records of their leagues. They played as avidly as any big league team out to win the pennant. But the rules differed from those of a regular game in one important way. On Alcatraz, if you knock the ball over the wall, you're out. It's not a home run and you couldn't get it was not a home run and you couldn't get out and get it either. We usually had an inmate that worked outside the wall, the gardener. He would throw them back. The kids who lived on the island did, in fact, collect convict handballs and baseballs. Once when I was 8, a prisoner found a hard rubber ball in the weeds and beckoned to me. I shyly approached. As the guard stood there and the man pushed the ball through the fence to me, it was a proud moment. I had it in my hand, the most valuable item on Alcatraz. The convicted ball handball, the coveted black handball that had rolled down the hill from over the prison yard wall. Many of the other details on Capone's time on Alcatraz are also true. There was, for example, a snitch box, which visitors and residents alike were required to walk through when entering the... Sorry, I lost my spot.
Entering the island.
I don't even know what paragraph I'm in. Second one?
You are in paragraph.
Avidly, the big league teams will but the rules were different. If you knock the ball over the wall, you're out. Oh, I'm way down. Many of the other details of Capone's time on Alcatraz are also true. There were, for example, a snitch box, which visitors and residents alike were required to walk through when entering the island, and when Capone's mother, Teresina Capone, came to visit him on the island, her corset did indeed set the snitch box off. Mrs. Capone, who barely spoke English, was visibly embarrassed at having to strip down to her corset, revealing the metal stays that tripped the metal detector. Capone was horribly ruthless, authorizing and sometimes performing the slaying of hundreds of people. But he could also be surprisingly generous. When the crash came in 1929, Al Capone was the first to open soup kitchens. So the crash, like the economic crash, he was the first to open the soup kitchens. Some people considered him a Robin Hood kind of character, or one of the fellow Alcatraz convicts described him. Outside of losing his head so easily and bragging about what he has done, Capone has a heart as big as a house. The accounts of children who grew up on Alcatraz differ accordingly to the time they lived on the island and their own individual experiences. A doctor who worked on the island in 1937 said, during their play, the children often came into close contact with the prisoners working on the outdoor details. On the other hand, one former Alcatraz island resident who I heard speak clearly stated she had no interaction with convicts whatsoever during her stay on the island, and a third said she formed a friendship with one convict based on the exchange of flowers. She called this inmate her boyfriend. The convict's mail was routinely censored, and wives of the guards were occasionally asked to help out at the task. As one of the convicts described it, it took a letter from 10 days to 2 weeks to get to you before it reached the institution. You see, all the incoming letters are censored and then given to different guards to type in duplicate when they have time. Nothing was personal. Every officer could take your letters and read them and then discuss your personal affairs with each other. The prisoner's personal mail was taken home by different officers to let their wives read. Incredible though it seems, residents of the island sang Christmas carols outside of the cell house with the express purpose of entertaining the convicts. As one of the women who lived on the island during the early 40s told me, caroling was a very big thing. And only the children who were the best singers were given the privilege of caroling to the convicts. It was certainly true that convicts were sometimes seen in the residential areas of the island. They were on the dock handling the laundry. They acted as the garbage men, gardeners, and sometimes movers and house painters for the guard who lived on the island. And while it is true that convicts are always supposed to be escorted by guards, it is certainly conceivable that in some cases that rule would have been bent or broken. Meeting Capone was a big thrill to kids who lived on the island. One 10-year-old boy described the day he met Capone. On rare occasions, dependents entered the prison proper. I became a more familiar figure because Dr. Hess, or medical assistant Charles Ping, gave me adrenaline shots for asthma. Of course, my father escorted me to and from the prison hospital dispensary. On the notable occasions Capone was being treated and my father's sense of history came through. He said, Al, this is my boy, Roy. Roll, Dad's nickname for me. This is Al Capone. Capone shook my hand and I said something and I suppose twitched around the way the 10-year-olds do. Capone said, good looking boy, boss. That was a big moment for a boy, and I can still recall the warmth of Capone's hand around mine. Though every attempt was made to make Al Capone Does My Shirts historically accurate, some details were changed to suit the story. For example, the weather, while true to the San Francisco Bay area in general, does not reflect the exact weather of 1935. Also, the island was run in a rigid military style, with orders working their way down the chain of command. Talking to a kid about the rules of the island will probably be something the warden would have delegated. And though the concept of separate schools for children with problems was certainly in existence, everything else was about the Esther P. Marinoff School is completely fictional. About Natalie, the character Natalie Flanagan will probably be diagnosed with autism. Autism is a disease that affects the way your brain and sensory system work. It usually becomes evident in the first 3 years of a child's life. When there is a whole range of behaviors of people with autism, typically a child with autism has an extremely difficult time making eye contact, playing with other kids, and sometimes even speaking. Children with autism are often prone to tantrums, receptive behaviors, and intense physical sensitivities and desensitivities, some sensations being heightened and even intolerable, others, which may include pain perception, being diminished or apparently absent. Temple Grandin, perhaps the most famous person with autism in the world today, says that autism is a near normal brain trapped inside a sensory system that does not work. Noted autism experts Theodore and Judith Mitrani described autism as extreme aloneness from the beginning of life. Autism wasn't identified until 1943, a full 8 years after this book takes place. Children with what we now call autism received many different diagnoses during the 1930s and were sometimes institutionalized. Up until quite recently, there was little hope for children with autism. As Oliver Sacks put it, we almost always speak of autistic children, never of autistic adults, as if such children never grew up or were somehow mysteriously spirited off the planet. But in the last few years, a lot of progress has been made in the treatment of autism. The most encouraging statistics show that intense early intervention with applied behavioral analysis can help as many as half of the children diagnosed with autism to achieve normal functioning. Natalie is a wholly functional character. She is not meant to symbolize or represent autism in any way. She was inspired by my own sister, Gina Johnson, who had a severe form of autism. That was the author's note.